The Reconstruction period followed the Civil War, 1865 to 1876. But what's the meaning of this word? Simply, Reconstruction means to rebuild. And generations of earlier historians talked about the rebuilding, the physical rebuilding of the South. That, however, was a deception. That was to divert the attention of the reader or of the listener away from the real meaning of Reconstruction. Yes, southern cities needed to be rebuilt. Yes, southern ports needed to be rebuilt. But this focus on rebuilding plays to a victim status in the South, that somehow the South was a victim of an aggressive and abusive army under people like Sherman. But in reality, Reconstruction was about rebuilding the relationship between the states and the federal government. The Confederate States of America rose up and attacked the United States of America. They were rebels. They were traitors. This caused a civil war. And so the primary meaning of Reconstruction is to rewrite the social contract. The Constitution broke down. The Constitution failed to protect the interest and the order of the United States of America. In just 4 short years, the relationship between the government in Washington and the states had radically changed. There were factual changes, real changes. So in reality, de facto, regardless of what happened in law, de jure, in fact, the federal government was supreme. In the rebellious states, the United States set up military dictatorships. The United States military governed the southern states. Those military dictators then reported directly to the president. State officers were under the guidance and under the supervision of the United States military, and that military answered directly to the president. There was nothing in the Constitution about this, because the Constitution didn't deal with the problem of rebellion. The southern states rebelled, and they lost a war. The president used the military to stop that rebellion, and so he was in fact controlling 50% of the territory of the United States of America at the end of the Civil War. The South refused to accept this new reality. Many Southerners believed that they could go on as if the war never happened. Southerners blamed Lincoln and his tyrannical rule for driving the country into division. And so a group of conspirators gathered together and planned the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. April 1865, John Wilkes Booth walks up behind Abraham Lincoln while he's at the theater and shoots him in the head. Abraham Lincoln was murdered at the end of the Civil War. The war was over. The South had already surrendered. Abraham Lincoln was killed because he was victorious in the Civil War, and these Southerners wanted their revenge. Southern states like Mississippi pushed what are called black codes, that even though slaves had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, that they would use the law to reduce them to servitude. These black codes stripped African Americans of their rights. They had no legal rights in the former Confederate states. The assassination of Lincoln and the development of black codes led to a division between radical Republicans, who were the majority in the United States Congress, and President Andrew Johnson. Radical Republicans had risen to power with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had formed a new political party based on the Free Soil movement. Those radical Republicans became abolitionists during the course of the war. They wanted slavery abolished. President Andrew Johnson was Abraham Lincoln's vice president. He was a Southerner, and so he wanted a more conciliatory approach to the South. That led to clashes between the two over the meaning of Reconstruction. Should the North push forth a radical policy of protecting the freedom for African Americans, or a more conciliatory policy of letting Southerners return to life as normal? Once again, this phrase, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, rose to the forefront of the political debate. What did it mean? Who would get these rights? Were they truly for all men? What should be done about slavery? Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolished slavery in 1865. Congress could do this because the Southern states had left the Union. This left a majority, a supermajority of non-slave owning states in the Union. Those non-slave owning states then produced this radical document that freed slaves, taking away the right of Negro slave owners. Congress also set up and funded a Freedmen's Bureau to help African Americans make the transition from slavery to freedmen, to help them learn about property rights, to help them learn about civil rights, to help them learn just the basics of reading and writing. Because as slaves, they couldn't own property. They couldn't speak. They couldn't defend themselves with a fair trial. They couldn't educate themselves. And so the federal government began to advocate for the rights of freedmen against the interest of Southern plantation owners. Congress passed a Civil Rights Bill in 1866, trying to stop Southern abuses of former slaves. And so Congress, for the first time, was exerting its authority, its sovereignty, to protect individual liberty against abusive states and abusive property owners. Instead of accepting this new reality, former Confederates formed an organization called the Ku Klux Klan in 1866. Its organizer and its leader was General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He claimed the Knights of the Klan were there to restore order, that the Civil War had ripped down the governments of the South and did not replace them with an effective system of order. And so Negro slaves were running free and they were terrorizing the country. And since the federal government wouldn't protect good law-abiding Southerners, that the Ku Klux Klan would ride to defend all of their virtues and their values. What this really was a terrorist organization. The Klan terrorized black families in the South. The Klan killed any outspoken freedmen who defended their right to liberty. The Klan used terror, violence, to advance a political agenda, white supremacy. The Klan was upset that the federal government had freed Negroes in their community, had lifted them out of servitude, and were helping them build a life based on freedom. The Klan wanted to return to the former days of white property ownership. And so the Klan used terror to kill not only slaves, but also to kill any federal agents trying to help them. And so here you see a Klan poster talking about freeing the South from white tyranny. That the men hanging came from Ohio. They were carpetbaggers. They were sent by the federal government to help African Americans lift themselves out of slavery and have freedom. This produced a resentment among the white population. Whites in the South presented themselves victims of federal tyranny, that that the federal government was taking advantage of the Civil War to undo God's plan on earth. The Klan then would use terrorism to defend the values of the lost cause. It was an honorable movement to defend the liberty of the South. It was an honorable cause to defend property rights in the South. It was simply a lost cause, but it was one that the South could hold their head up. One day they would overthrow federal tyranny and return to their heritage. Instead of cowering in fear to these terrorists, the United States of America pushed forward with a 14th Amendment in 1868, granting all people born in the United States to be citizen of the United States. Birthright citizenship. This happened because Southerners wanted to deny the rights of citizens to African Americans. They believed that America was only for white people, and that as Negroes, as Africans, they had no claim to citizenship. The 14th Amendment clarified that for good. Anyone born in the United States would be a citizen of the United States. The 14th Amendment went farther. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunity of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of laws. Why was this necessary? Because even after the Civil War, states were trying to make laws to discriminate against African Americans. States were trying to deprive people of their life, their liberty, and their property without due process of laws. States were not providing equal protection for African Americans. So this became a federal responsibility. The federal government took away the Southerners' right to discriminate, and the power to protect civil liberties became a constitutional or a federal right. One of the more contentious debates was over the right to vote in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War, 4 years after the freeing of slaves. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any of the states on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That appears to be a very broad statement protecting the right to vote. But was it? Were there any loopholes? We know there are loopholes because there was an argument between Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist, a former slave, and Susan B. Anthony, a suffragette who wanted suffrage for women. Frederick Douglass signed on to and agreed to this language. The right of citizens of the United States shall not be denied or disparaged or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. What's missing? Women. The United States can deny the right to vote to women. Susan B. Anthony had been working with Frederick Douglass to promote the interest of African Americans in the United States. She was an abolitionist, and she thought at the end of the war that not only would African Americans get the right to vote, but women would get the right to vote. The United States Congress did not want to go that far. They accepted that freed slaves could vote, but they weren't willing to expand the definition of people to include women. There was also another big loophole that the southern states exploited in prison labor. Southern states denied the right to vote to prisoners. You see, this wasn't denying the right to vote on account of race, or color, or previous condition of servitude. No, if someone had committed a crime, they had to go to jail and they couldn't vote. Sounds perfectly reasonable. In the next 60 years, though, who was most likely to go to jail in the South? An African American male. This amendment allowed Southern states to strip black males of their rights as citizens to vote by sending them to prison. As prisoners, they became slave laborers, and as slave laborers, they had no right to vote. So Reconstruction then had some very lofty goals, but the Southern states continued to find ways around these new amendments. Reconstruction then rebuilt the relationship between the states and the federal government based on a new federal supremacy. This was not only a de facto change, this was a de jure change in law. The constitutional amendments rewrote the Constitution, rewrote the social contract to give more power to the federal government. Congress had new powers. The president had new powers. Southern states had to accept this new reality or remain occupied. If they didn't ratify the Reconstruction amendments, they weren't going to be allowed back into the United States of America. The United States of America wrote the ground rules at which the Southern states become citizens of the United States again. Reconstruction marked a midway point through a very long journey of American history, in which the earliest period, in the colonial period, government was a private enterprise. Whether it was the private enterprise of the king, or the private enterprise of a company at Jamestown, or a private enterprise like the Pilgrims. Reconstruction made it clear that government was a public service. It was there to promote the interest of the general public and not private landowners. It marked a midway point between the transformation from privileges to rights. Reconstruction expanded the amount of individual liberty. Individual liberty, a right to property, a right to liberty, a right to vote, but didn't expand it all the way to include women, didn't expand it all the way to universally protect the rights of freedmen or African Americans. There were still many changes to come, but Reconstruction changed the mindset that the federal government would protect individuals against abusive state and property owners.